The wheel weaves as the wheel wills. Try saying that 10 times fast. Hi everybody, welcome back to Between the Lines. My name's Julian, I'm an obsessive reader and used book collector, and today I'm very happy to be finally reviewing The Eye of the World, the first book in the Wheel of Time. So this review is going to be a mix of spoilers and spoiler-free. I will start with the spoiler-free section, so if you haven't read the book yet, or if you're, still thinking about whether or not to start the series, you'll be safe. And once I get into the spoiler section, I'll put a tag up on the screen so you don't get ruined for anything in the book. So let's just get into it because I have a ton to talk about today. So as the show is premiering today on Amazon Prime, I wanted to do this review in time for it. And a lot of people might be coming off of this show and wondering whether or not to start the series. So hopefully this review will kind of illuminate what I liked about the first book and whether or not it's worth it for you to go and take that deep dive. I'm just going to tell you right now, it's worth it. So The Wheel of Time is a series that I first encountered through my contact with BookTube. Somehow for the first 25 years of my life, I had never heard of this series. And in starting to watch BookTube videos a couple of years ago, of course, I came upon Daniel Green's channel, which was the big one that got me into BookTube, and from there learned about The Wheel of Time, why it was so great, and that this, there was this titan of fantasy that existed that I had never come across before. And as the hype for the show was growing this year, I thought to myself, okay, maybe it's time to start reading the series. And as we got closer and closer to November, I said, okay, it's time. Let's make that dive. Let's go into the Wheel of Time series and let's start The Eye of the World in time for the show coming out. All right, quick note from the editor here. When I was putting this video together, I realized I totally neglected to give any sort of background or history of the series. And for someone coming to this gigantic, epic mega series for the first time like me, it's pretty important to know this stuff. So The Wheel of Time is an epic high fantasy series written by Robert Jordan over the course of a couple of decades, starting with 1990's The Eye of the World and ending with 2013's A Memory of Light. However, in the course of writing the series, Robert Jordan passed away, and Brandon Sanderson, the author of the Stormlight Archive and Mistborn, was brought on to finish the last 3 books. So this series is epic high fantasy, so that means it's its own created world with its own unique locations, rules, magic, characters, monsters, all that good stuff you've come to expect with the genre. And also some great stuff like the classic mysteries you get with this sort of storytelling, prophecies, and the forces of good fighting the forces of evil. So the first book in the series, The Eye of the World, kicks off following the adventures of Rand al'Thor, a young sheep herder from the Two Rivers in a little village called Emond's Field. And his life is upended when creatures that he thought were only from myth attack his village, and he's whisked away on an adventure with 4 other of his peers, along with 2 mysterious figures that also just arrived in the Two Rivers. And these 2 people are claiming that the young people's lives are more important than they may have thought, and that their destinies lie elsewhere than Emond's Field. This is a very rudimentary breakdown of what the beginning part of The Eye of the World is about. That just kind of sets the stage of, it's a grand adventure tale, and starts with somewhat tropey fantasy ideas, the young farm boy going on a grand adventure. We've seen that a bunch of times before, but it takes those tropes and the author puts his own spin on it. And I'm definitely not doing it justice by explaining it in this way, but The Wheel of Time is so huge, so vast, so detailed, and so deep that that's all I can give you right now. And I just wanted to give my thoughts in a spoiler-free way, and then once I get into the spoilers, I'll talk the details. So what did I think of The Eye of the World? Well, I really enjoyed it. The hype wasn't wrong. I had heard all this stuff that made it seem like it was what I was into with fantasy, and it was absolutely correct. This book was just, pure classic fantasy vibes. It had the grand epic prologue that set the stage for, the world, but also raised a lot of questions and mysteries that I wanted to figure out immediately. And then has, those tropey story beats, which I really liked, where, it starts with that prologue and then goes, deep into a day in the life of the main character, who's just this modest sheep herder, and then the story explodes and goes from there. It has that classic hero's journey set up. Typically, I'm not a fan of when people use the hero's journey as a crutch to tell their story, but I feel the way that Robert Jordan used it here was to use those tropes as an anchor to get you grounded in this huge and epic world he's created, and then kind of veering away from it a bit more as the story went on and becoming more of his own thing. The beginning of the story also borrowed heavily from The Lord of the Rings. This is something I knew about going into it though, so I wasn't upset or, you know, shocked or anything like that. I'm a huge Lord of the Rings fan. That's my favorite book series of all time. So instead of being angry about it that this borrowed so much from it, I was actually curious to see the parallels and then the ways in which Robert Jordan diverged from those inspirations as the story went along. Specifically, the Fellowship of the Ring. The first kind of act of this book borrowed a lot from the Fellowship of the Ring, down to, you know, locations and the way the story progressed and the rules of some characters as well, although they did have their own spin on them. And this version of that story felt a bit more grounded and human. We really got more into the psychology of the main characters specifically here. These characters feel very human, very grounded, and that's something that I wanted to commend Robert Jordan for, and this was really getting us on the side of the characters. And although there was some, you know, character conflict as some people who weren't necessarily likable right off the bat, he did a good job in showing that they were human and that these behaviors, attitudes, and personalities were realistic and fleshed out. At first, I gotta say though, it took me a little while to get on the side of the characters and to really find the distinction in their personalities. They felt a little samey to me in the earlier parts of the book, specifically, you know, the main group of protagonists. But as the story progressed, they started to diverge a little more, and everyone's personalities became more distinct and more memorable, and everyone went on their own separate arcs that ended in a different way. And even people who had, you know, similar trajectories, because they were different people, they responded to what was happening around them very differently, and by the end of the book, they became totally different people. I can say though with absolute confidence that the one character who was, you know, 100% them from the beginning of the book though was Matt. I'm not gonna say anything to give away who he is or what his story's about, but that guy had such a distinct and, you know, loud personality right from the get-go. And something that was also great about these characters too was that although they were very well written, some of these characters are so dumb. And I'm not saying that Robert Jordan did a bad job in writing them, I'm just saying that their actual personalities, the psychologies of these characters, some of them are just really dumb. By the end of the book, you know, they changed so much that they were maybe more badass or more developed, but still dumb, developed badasses. And I think the main character, Randolph Thor, perfectly embodies the dumb, young, adult male. He just makes some really bad and ill-thought decisions throughout the book. And I can say this in confidence because I definitely was that dumb, young adult male a few years ago and probably still am. And one thing I thought that the author did really well with these characters and setting them on their journey was never letting go of character conflicts. You know, there's some interpersonal conflict between people of this group, and they don't necessarily get over them. Some of these relationships evolve, but you know, it's not just, hey, let's go on an adventure, we're all great friends, there's nothing wrong with what's happening right now. There's stuff going on. People are being resistant to this change, and the people that are driving them on this adventure, you know, have different motives from the people who are being dragged on it. So there's always conflict there, and those really develop in an interesting way throughout the book. It really reminded me of when I was a kid and reading those sort of adventure books that I absolutely just fell in love with the world and kickstarted my love of fantasy. Specifically, this reminded me of Deltora Quest. I don't know how many of you have read those books, and this was also paralleled in a book series that I really enjoyed as a kid that, you know, hasn't really aged well for most people. I haven't read them recently, so I don't know how well they've aged, but that's the Eragon series. And as I was reading, especially the first kind of act of The Eye of the World, I was thinking, like, this is pretty familiar, like, not just in terms of, like, the hero's journey, you know, Star Wars, Luke Skywalker kind of stuff, but I was like, where have I read this before? And then Daniel on Twitter pointed out that this really reminded him of Eragon, and I was like, yeah, that author must have pulled so much from this series along with Lord of the Rings and Star Wars. Another thing I had heard of before getting into this book and that I was sort of warned about was that it could be too wordy and the prose too dense. I've complained about very dense and wordy prose in the past, specifically with some H.P. Lovecraft stories, but I think Robert Jordan did a very good job here in having, you know, dense text that was very descriptive and very detailed, but it never really bogged down the scenes for me. But for me, as a Lord of the Rings fan, you know, having the dense, wordy, very descriptive fantasy prose wasn't new, and I thought it was actually really well done and wasn't a complaint for me at all. And in talking about detail, every location he wrote was so vibrant and felt so alive because of his words, that even though, you know, they went to a bunch of different places, and even with similar locations, like you could take one town versus another, he did such a good job of making them unique through his writing, and he did a great job of revealing the magic system and the world building. I thought that everything was easy enough to understand, and that we kind of had a grasp of what was going on in the world and what the characters were experiencing, and having these characters be as in the dark as we are as a reader and learning all of this, it felt organic for that to be explained and not necessarily like an exposition dump. And the magic itself, you know, felt mysterious, but we also knew a bit of the stakes and limitations with it. It didn't feel video gamey with those limitations where, you know, there's specific power-ups and moves, which is something I'm not necessarily super into, but I liked the balance it made between understanding some stakes and making it feel mysterious and ethereal and dangerous at the same time. And a lot of the cultures and fantasy races that were invented for this book felt like unique blends of kind of what I had read before. They weren't the most unique, I'll say that. I've definitely encountered more unique races or cultures in fantasy books, but they felt like interesting blends of some things I had never seen kind of combined together. So overall, you know, I really enjoyed The Eye of the World and can't wait to get into The Great Hunt. And I'm gonna start talking spoilers now. So if you haven't read the book or just don't care, be warned going forward, because from this point on, there's gonna be spoilers. One thing I enjoyed about this book was the pacing, and this book took me a little while longer to read. I usually do about a book a week, but considering that this book was like, what, 300,000 words, took me, I think, like 12 days to finish. I think though that the pacing in the middle maybe sagged a little bit once, you know, the group or the fellowship, I'm not sure what to call them, splits up into different directions. So after the whole incident at Shadar Logoth, when everyone goes their separate ways, I thought it kind of sagged a little, and there seemed to be a little bit of wheel spinning, and I thought there was a lot of similar conflicts that were repeated a couple of times, specifically with the Rand and Mat storyline that was going on there. But one thing I can really commend is that a lot of the character development happened here, specifically with characters like Nynaeve and Perrin, and of course Mat's descent into craziness because of the Mordeth knife. So I think that was the only time I felt it kind of sagged for me, but once everything came together at Caemlyn again, I really started ramping up. And there was one thing I wanted to point out that happened in this book that was something that irritated me a little bit about the Dark Tower, which happened a lot and it happened here as well, is that if characters had communicated certain small things just way earlier, so much conflict would be avoided. And I'm talking specifically here about the three boys not mentioning their dreams to Moiraine and stuff like that. So it was a little bit frustrating, especially since I had encountered it before in the Dark Tower, and that was super frustrating. So much could have gone better in that series if people had just talked to each other. But I'll say here that there was a good in-story reason for it, for them not trusting Moiraine and still kind of believing that the Aes Sedai are this, you know, bad organization that they should be scared of. So I understand why they wouldn't tell her, but if they had just told her about the dreams way earlier, you know, things may have gone a bit differently and definitely easier for those three boys. This series has existed around me for a couple years now in my awareness of it, and because of the show and all the hype surrounding it, I've absorbed so much about the series that I probably shouldn't have known at this point. And spoilers for the last line of the book, but you know, Rand is the Dragon Reborn. Who knew? I'm not sure if this was meant to be played as a mystery or something, but just because I knew that he was the Dragon Reborn before going into this book, it was so painfully obvious that he was. And I'm a little bit biased because, you know, I know that he was a Dragon Reborn going into this, so I thought that every clue that was laid to it was, you know, super obvious. And I'm not sure, as a first-time reader who is more blind than me going into this book, whether or not that was supposed to be obvious to them as well, or whether or not it was just supposed to be obvious that he was a channeler. But then again, the whole thing about him being born outside Emond's Field on the slopes of Dragonmount was like, okay, yeah, this dude is definitely the Dragon Reborn. So let me know in the comments if it was supposed to be a mystery like that, if you went into this book blind. But I will say though, the scene when he finally channels all out at the end in that battle with the Trollocs and the soldiers from Faldara was super epic and worth the build-up, and it was a really exciting climax. And even though I knew that, and I guess that was supposed to be the main twist of the book, there are still some good twists in there that I didn't expect, especially Padan Fain. I did not think that he was gonna be way more important in the story than he was. I thought he was just kind of like a dick at the beginning, and I kind of had assumed that he died in the attack at Emond's Field. And then when he appeared again at Baerlon, I was like, oh, he survived, but you know, something's a little wrong with him. And I thought that the most he would do was sell out the group to, I don't know, maybe the White Cloaks or the Dark Friends. What's up with this guy? You know, where's his character going in the future? I'm very excited to see what happens with him going forward and how he ties in to the Shadow. And to talk about how this book wrapped up, something I had heard before going into this was that a lot of people think that the Eye of the World almost could be taken as a standalone. Like, if you don't want to read the rest of the series, at least you get a complete-ish story if you just want to read the first one. And I think I have to disagree with that. The ending to me felt a tad bit rushed, like a lot of stuff was being kind of tied up really quickly, and that a lot of the other plots were kind of being, you know, pushed to the side for later entries. If it really was a complete story that you could take as a standalone, I thought that maybe some other stuff should have come into play that were set up throughout the story. Elements like the White Cloaks, Elias, and the Wolves. Oh, and Tom Marilyn too, how could I forget? He's maybe alive. We'll see what happens. I know this stuff will probably be expanded upon and further developed in later books, but I just thought if this was meant to be potentially a standalone, then that stuff being pushed to other entries doesn't make sense to me. But let me know if I'm totally wrong about this, and if that's a notion that nobody has, that this is supposed to be a standalone. That's just what I heard. So if you're coming here from having watched the show, I hope maybe my opinions and my discussion about the story have influenced you whether or not to take that dive into the series. And if you've read this book already and have been a fan of the series for a lot longer than me, I've only read the first book, then welcome, and I hope my theories and ideas aren't too dumb. Something I want to mention before I go is that when I read a big series like this, like when I did Lord of the Rings, The Dark Tower, Harry Potter, I like to listen to podcasts that discuss and kind of recap a chapter by chapter breakdown of the story. And for The Eye of the World and for the rest of the Wheel of Time, I'm going to be listening to the Wheel Weaves podcast. It's super great. They're also Canadian like me, and they're taking a really insightful and spoiler-free deep dive into the series. Currently, they're on book 6, and I just listened to the book 1 episodes, so I'm still a good ways behind, but they're super insightful, super funny, and having it be spoiler-free where one of the hosts is an expert in the series and one of them is a newcomer to the series just like me was really interesting, in a way to further have things almost clarified or brought up that I may have missed. So in the comments, let me know if you're gonna take that dive and start the Wheel of Time series, and if you're coming here from the show or not. And also let me know if you have read The Eye of the World, what did you think of it? Was it a good introduction to this series, or were you more mixed on it? I'm super excited to get into The Great Hunt. I think I'm gonna get into that in a couple weeks. I'm currently reading Side Jobs, the first short story collection from the Dresden Files. Then I think I'm gonna read a Foundation book or two, and then I'm gonna get into The Great Hunt in December, and I can't wait to start it. So before you go, remember to do all the YouTube stuff like liking and subscribing. It really helps out, and definitely leave a comment if you have some thoughts about my thoughts. Thank you for watching. Please remember to support your local library, and I'll see you next time.